Okay, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Welcome both in person and in the cybersphere. I'm Daniel Robinson. I'm the convener and recurring host of the FIMS seminar series. This is the first one for this semester. We will have 3 of these this semester and then 3 more in the winter term. So we certainly welcome your attendance and participation in these events that highlight, showcase the research of faculty members here in our faculty. So today we have first up in our roster is Professor Grant Campbell, who many of you will know. Of course, if you've had some experiences in the LIS or the MLIS program. He teaches in both of those programs, and in the past as well in the MIT program. He teaches courses primarily in the area of organization of information, the theory and practice of descriptive cataloging, classification, and indexing. Today, his talk is on I would say kind of a variation of that, or a kind of extension of that. His talk today is called Big Data and Dementia, Implications for Diagnosis. So, Grant, thank you for signing up first up, and
I'll take it. Thank you all for coming, both here and there. I'm delivering this presentation at Western University on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Chinookan peoples. I wrote this presentation in Toronto on the traditional lands of the Mississauga, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat peoples. I wish also to acknowledge an intellectual debt to 2 authors, Joshua Whitehead, an Oji-Neheu member of the Peguis First Nation, and Billy Ray Belcourt of the Driftpile Cree Nation. While they have no direct relationship to this paper, I was reading their work while writing it. The finesse with which they both describe how global patterns of the human community inscribe themselves, sometimes brutally, on the most intimate human aspects of human lives, undoubtedly influenced my thinking, and I thank them for it. The presentation I'm about to deliver is an offshoot of an ongoing project which addresses various problems of dementia care from the perspective of knowledge organization. As many of you know, this project has been going on for a long time, interrupted from time to time by family deaths, administrative duties, and world events. The work I'm presenting here is not an intrinsic part of my project, but it deals with certain questions that came to my attention and which I think deserve further research. Like many ongoing projects, mine rests on the generosity of many people and groups that you see here. My larger project examines the related problems of classification and vocabulary that affect individuals who are caring for a close family member with dementia. And I'm doing so with the assistance of a theory of modes first presented by the literary critic Northrop Frye in his 1990 work Words with Power. I'm arguing that we can classify information related to dementia and indeed the care itself according to 4 primary modes: description, dialectic, rhetoric, and imagination. This presentation is drawn from my chapter on the descriptive mode, in which we attempt to understand dementia as a real-world phenomenon, a condition that is recognized and defined in terms of the physical and social world we live in. And a great deal of information from the medical, healthcare, and research communities is in this mode. In that chapter, I suggest that the descriptive mode is particularly prominent during the time of diagnosis, the process whereby both patient and family have their suspicions confirmed, whether tentatively or definitively. While researching and writing that chapter, I noticed that the medical research community has a growing interest in the adaptation of machine learning methods to improve the diagnostic process. And I want to address that interest in a very tentative way in this presentation. The period of clinical diagnosis, a time of tests and discussions and confessions and analysis, is a deeply stressful time, both for the person being diagnosed and for the person's family. The time of testing and diagnosis marks an intersection of two possible futures, one characterized as normal and the other as abnormal. However loosely the term dementia may be applied in lay circles, medical sources agree dementia is not to be confused with the normal decline of human capacity that awaits all of us who live long enough. Dementia is, quote, not related to normal aging, declares the American Academy of Family Physicians. And from the National Institute for Neurological Disorders and Strokes, quote, while everyone loses some neurons as they age, people with dementia experience far greater loss. Unlike dementia, age-related memory loss isn't disabling, end of quote. And the National Library of Medicine concurs. It is normal, they say, to become a bit more forgetful as you age, but dementia is not a normal part of aging. For the patient and family, then, the diagnosis can feel like a momentous fork in the road. A patient without dementia will die eventually, but normally. A patient with a dementia, such as Alzheimer's, will die eventually, but abnormally, and probably in a state of complete helplessness. In this sense, a diagnosis of dementia could resemble a curse, a ruthless, relentless verdict that descends, seemingly at random, upon the loved one, wreaking havoc on the life of the entire family. Furthermore, the term dementia, as defined by the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the U.S. National Institute on Aging, and the World Health Organization, refers not to a disease, but to a group of symptoms. These symptoms are caused by a range of possible underlying diseases or disorders. To say that a loved one has dementia, then, is not like saying the loved one has cancer or diabetes. Rather, the loved one suffers from one or more diseases or injuries which have caused one or more cognitive deficits. For this reason, determining the cause and producing a reliable diagnosis takes time and involves testing across the full range of neurocognitive domains recognized by the DSM, not just memory, but language, perceptual motor function, social cognition, complex attention, and executive function. These tests frequently seek not to detect a presence, but to confirm an absence, to eliminate possibilities patiently and systematically until the clinician is left with a reasonable, if not decisive, confirmation. Because of this complexity, misdiagnosis is an ongoing and grave concern. Symptoms of Alzheimer's disease are similar to those of other causes, such as Lewy body or frontotemporal dementia. They can also arise from causes beyond dementia as side effects of other ailments. Researchers doing clinical trials and treatments for Alzheimer's, for instance, have difficulty recruiting subjects whose condition can safely be called Alzheimer's. And clinicians can easily confuse one kind of dementia with another, or with another condition altogether. One of the studies I will be discussing today provided evidence of cases of frontotemporal dementia in being initially diagnosed as Alzheimer's disease, organic dementia, Lewy body dementia, cerebrovascular dementia, Parkinson's disease, corticobasal degeneration, multiple system atrophy, small vessel disease, normal pressure hydrocephalus, psychiatric disorder, space-occupying lesion, progressive supranuclear palsy, paraneoplastic surge syndrome, and Huntington's disease. Given both the importance of diagnosis and the problems to which the diagnostic process is vulnerable, medical researchers are eager to find means of supporting and enhancing the standard diagnostic procedures as specified in standards such as the DSM-5 and the World Health Organization International Classification. Biomarkers detected through genetic scans and other procedures have provided suggestive clues, but to date there is no wide consensus on how the tests are to be interpreted, and not all clinical settings can afford access to them. And so medical researchers are naturally exploring the potential of machine learning and big data. When I use the term big data, I am referring to the practice of applying machine learning algorithms to large volumes of data for purposes of discovery, inference, and prediction. This practice has spawned an industry of sorts known as predictive analytics, which has been adopted in various domains, ranging from insurance to banking, human resources, medicine, policing, and aviation, among others. Much of the popular appeal of predictive analytics stems from its startling assertion that correlation can be separated from causation. As stated by Mayer, Schoenberger, and Kukier in their popular apology of big data, quote, there is a treasure hunt underway, driven by the insights to be extracted from data and the dormant value that can be unleashed by a shift from causation to correlation. While such a split has its uses in basic research, which is striving for new and unforeseen insight, it has led to fanciful and attractive conceits of entrepreneurial magic. Eric Siegel's book on predictive analytics, for instance, carries the catchy subtitle, The Power to Predict Who Will Quit, Buy, Lie, or Die, and promises to show, for instance, that early retirement leads to shorter life expectancy and that vegetarians miss fewer flights. On the other hand, authors such as Kathy O'Neill warn of the dangers of inferring from data that has only a tenuous and poorly understood relationship to variables of interest. The best predictive models, she argues, work from data that is directly pertinent to a phenomenon rather than relying on proxy variables that merely correlate to that phenomenon. Racism, she states, is, quote, the most slovenly of predictive models, powered by haphazard data gathering and spurious correlations, reinforced by institutional inequities and polluted by confirmation bias. Within the medical research and healthcare communities, big data serves various functions. It is used in efforts to discover new treatments, new cures, new methods of addressing ongoing and persistent challenges. More important for my purposes, it is also used in efforts to enhance the delivery and effectiveness of medical and healthcare services, including those involving the diagnosis of dementia. As David Snowden discovered back in 1986, large archives of longitudinal data can be statistically analyzed to yield important insights. One such archive led to this famous FIMS study. The two studies I'm describing today, while using more complex machine learning methods, approach their tasks in a similar spirit, using large archives of data collected over a long period in order to glean insights that might otherwise pass us by. This presentation deals with two studies, which you see here. First, a 2019 study that applied an artificial intelligence algorithm to data that had been amassed through years of diagnosing frontotemporal dementia, and a 2021 publication of a study that measured the ability of 4 different algorithms to predict a dementia diagnosis within 2 years. In the interest of time, I'm going to focus primarily on this second one in this presentation. I chose these two studies for the following reasons. First, they offer 2 different ways in which big data might enhance the speed and accuracy of diagnosis. Both use machine learning algorithms to find patterns in data sets that are too large for conventional analysis. Both are comparatively recent. And perhaps most important, both projects appear to be both modest and useful. They used data that was derived from a specific and well-defined population and was directly pertinent to the problems they were seeking to address. In so doing, they avoided grandiose disruptions of causation and correlation. They were aiming for practical, concrete improvements rather than trying to spin data flax into diagnostic gold. The first study shows big data being used to conduct a clinical audit. Using an anonymized database from the Memory Clinic in the Brain Center of Southmead Hospital in Bristol in the United Kingdom, the researchers applied an analytic tool known as FreezeWise to longitudinal data from 2009 to 2017 concerning patients who had been ultimately diagnosed with frontotemporal dementia. The data consisted of clinical letters, discharge summaries, request sheets, and investigation reports. And additional data was added concerning diagnostic accuracy, time, cost, and invasiveness of interventions. The program analyzed all of this data according to a reward system using what the authors call a doctor-defined payoff table to assess the value of clinical decisions. And the aim was to produce a list of improvements in testing, diagnosing, and treating frontotemporal dementia that could achieve the most optimal efficiency for the entire hospital. The study produced some interesting and provocative results, including that the best diagnosis of frontotemporal dementia remains traditional clinical diagnosis, together with biochemical blood investigations. The benefits of magnetic resonance imaging and SPECT scans were outweighed, according to this study, by the cost, waiting time, and distress to the patients. Also, it suggested that significant delays and unnecessary referrals and tests were caused by clinics not having access to the patient's full record, a problem exacerbated by the lack of an integrated clinical letter system. There's a lot more to be said about this study, which I won't go into here, but let me point out some features of interest. First, machine learning is not used in the study to replace standard practice in the memory clinic, but to produce a clinical audit of that practice that can identify problems and suggest improvements. Second, there's not a lot of information available on the freeze-wide analytical tool, but it appears to operate according to a reward system architecture, in which the program analyzes the data available at each node and produces a score that ranks the outcome of each visit to the clinic in terms of desirable result, on a scale from -1, which would be an incorrect diagnosis, to +1, which would be a correct and firm diagnosis. The authors describe this score as, in their words, quote, a translation of what a human being would consider a good or bad outcome into a numerical figure that the AI can understand, end of quote. The second study also draws on memory clinic data, this time assembled from 30 Alzheimer's disease centers in the United States, collected between September 2005 and February 2015. The project aimed to shorten the time between a prediction of dementia and its accurate diagnosis, using data typically available in standard clinical settings. 258 variables were selected for analysis, divided among the following categories. So you can see that 15 of the variables came from the demographic data, 21 from medications, from the neurological exam, Parkinson's score, etc. Obviously, 258 variables are a lot. The study set out to ascertain which of these were effective predictors of dementia. The researchers employed 4 different machine learning algorithms and tested their predictions against those derived by 2 standard tests for establishing risk of dementia: the cardiovascular risk factors, aging, and incidence of dementia risk score, or the CADE, and the brief dementia screening indicator of PDSI. The first model employed logistic regression, a specific form of multiple regression. Multiple regression is a standard statistical technique for analyzing the influence of multiple independent variables upon one dependent variable. Logistic regression adapts this process for cases in which the outcome is a dichotomy. It is therefore commonly used in medical cases for predicting binary outcomes, such as assessing whether a proposed treatment is likely or unlikely to cure the patient. Logistic regression plots instances upon a grid and establishes a decision threshold between the 2 outcomes. The decision threshold was set at 0.5. I will come back to this point shortly. The second model employed support vector machine modeling. This model resembles logistic regression, except that it also pays attention to the width of the margin on either side of the decision threshold. The greater the margin, the more reliable the prediction. Random forest modeling works on the principle of the decision tree, in which a model is derived from a training data set involving a series of tests. The test begins with a root node and moves through 0 or more internal nodes to arrive at a prediction. The forest algorithm applies the decision tree process to a collection of randomly selected subsets of the data. The results are collated and the majority verdict constitutes the prediction. And the final method, gradient boosted trees, is similar to random forest modeling, but uses a sequential system of testing, enabling each subsequent test to learn from the previous iteration. The results of the study look impressive and promising. The researchers were able to identify 6 variables that were effective predictors for all machine learning models. The time that the patient took to complete a trail making test, orientation, memory, home and hobbies impairment, the clinical judgment of decline, and the patient's level of independence. In predicting the likelihood of dementia from any cause, the 4 models provided far greater positive predictive value over 2 years than those produced by the Cade and BDSI tests, which is understandable since they were meant to predict the onset over 6 years rather than 2. Logistic regression proved most effective in predicting dementia of the Alzheimer's type and for other unclassified forms of dementia. The support vector machine model offered the best predictions of Lewy bodies disease, and all 4 models were equally effective in predicting vascular dementia. Now, again, there are some features of interest that I want to point out. First, the study attempts to predict a diagnosis of dementia within a comparatively short time frame. A prediction is not the same as a diagnosis, and the DSM-5 explicitly distinguishes the two when it urges clinicians to base their diagnoses on symptoms and not on risk factors. Obesity, for instance, may increase the likelihood of developing diabetes, but the mere fact that a patient is obese does not alone constitute grounds for diagnosing diabetes. The algorithms used in this study were never intended to replace clinical diagnosis. They aimed rather to bring that diagnosis about sooner, thereby reducing the stress on patient and family and reducing the number of intrusive, costly, intimidating, and unnecessary tests that might be run. Second, the models were designed to predict a binary outcome, a diagnosis of dementia. This is totally understandable from the point of view of the doctor who has to prescribe some sort of treatment in the face of the verdict, and of the patient who has important decisions to make. It's important, however, to recognize that the diagnostic standards, such as DSM-5, have 3 categories and not 2: normal cognition, mild neurocognitive impairment, and major neurocognitive impairment, which we typically call dementia. In a very real sense, dementia occurs along a continuum. The machine learning models are imposing cutoff points along that continuum, typically called decision thresholds, thereby turning a continuum into a binarism. Third, we must recognize that the models do not do away with professional medical expertise. Of the 6 variables that had the highest predictive value, one of the top performers was the recorded clinical judgment of the patient's decline in functioning. Clinical judgment is embedded into these models and forms a crucial aspect of the training of the algorithms. Finally, the specific nature of the population should be taken into account. The average age was 72.3, and as frequenters of memory clinics, all of the subjects presumably suffered or feared that they suffer from mild neurocognitive impairment. This was not a matter of reading the palms of 25-year-olds to predict who will lie and who will die, as Eric Siegel would put it. The algorithms were exercised on a sample that generalized to a population for whom the results had the greatest chance of being reliable and useful. But here I have to pause and address a rather large elephant in the group, which is my own lack of expertise. I am not a computer scientist. I have neither the training nor the experience to lift the hood off these algorithms and understand fully how they work and why. I am not a doctor of medicine. I lack the training and experience to grasp fully the nuances of diagnosis, of neuroimaging, of genetic markers. I am not a psychologist, nor am I a statistician. Whatever cognitive authority I have to address these complex issues derives from my training and experience in knowledge organization, the practice of gathering information from different knowledge domains when they converge upon a common concern, and to alleviate difficulties experienced by members of the human community who are curious, who are learning, or who are suffering. My contribution, therefore, lies not in providing answers, but by posing questions. And I submit that we must all work together to answer the following questions. First, the first question would not surprise the authors of this article, who raised it in their discussion of the study's limitations. Quote, although our study used a large sample of memory clinic attendees in the United States, making our results highly applicable to this setting, the extent to which these results will generalize to other populations is unknown. End of quote. So what happens when we extend the use of these models beyond the population of a memory clinic, middle-aged and elderly people who are experiencing concerns with their memory? Do these impressive positive predictive values still hold with people whose memory is intact, but present symptoms in other neurocognitive domains, such as language, executive function, or perception and motor control? Do they hold up in populations with a greater number of people who present no symptoms? Do they hold with younger populations? Do the models of this in this study have a predictive power that can alert individuals of their risk at an early age, thereby making it possible for physicians to intervene more productively and for patients and their families to take sensible actions in response? Early detection is certainly desirable on many fronts, but is there a danger of these algorithms becoming another semi-mystical predictive tool, like the hair whorls at the top of our heads that were once assumed to predict our sexual orientation? Second, where exactly can we locate the clinical judgments that determine how the models predict outcomes? In the data preparation stage, for instance, how is qualitative data such as clinical judgment of decline or home and hobbies impairment converted into a quantitative variable? How are the yes-no binarisms of decision trees determined? And above all, how are continuous variables converted into binary outputs? At the level of logistic regression, how is the decision boundary determined that divides the no predictions from the yes predictions? The article states that the decision thresholds were set at, quote, 0.5, which equally weights false positive and false negative errors. Area under the receiver operating characteristic curve was used to summarize model performance over all possible thresholds and thus misclassification error weightings. I do not know what that means, nor have I so far been successful in learning what it means. But before I allow myself or anyone I love to make important decisions based on such tests, I want to know who made that threshold and how it was devised. Third, do these models make any allowance for a fact pointed out by the World Health Organization, that key and even decisive criteria for a diagnosis of dementia are socially constructed and vary according to context? The International Classification of Diseases warns us in the following passage that certain factors should not necessarily be construed as evidence of dementia. Quote, dementia produces an appreciable decline, but how such a decline manifests itself will depend largely on the social and cultural setting in which the patient lives. Changes in role performance, such as lowered ability to keep or find a job, should not be used as criteria of dementia because of the large cross-cultural differences that exist in what is appropriate, and because there may be frequent externally imposed changes in the availability of work within a particular culture. End of quote. How then is the variable degree of independence determined? Certain people, particularly those who are wealthy or command privilege, may have fewer calls upon their self-reliance. Similarly, interest in hobbies, while undoubtedly revealing, would vary between the hobby. Some activities, such as music, entail high levels of retained ability and interest, while others are more vulnerable. Is this something that the algorithms can account for? And finally, in closing, I wish to articulate two formidable challenges, not in the use of these algorithms, but in communicating the results of these algorithms to families who are worried and frightened. First, machine learning relies on numbers. And as Scott Slovic has persuasively argued, it is difficult for human beings to comprehend quantitative data in its full significance. Quote, so much of what we really need to understand about the world today comes in the form of numbers. And yet, numbers are both useful and in some way tragically unhelpful in the sense that they leave us without the proper affect. We don't really know their true meaning in a sense, and we often need other ways of reaching into that information and figuring out how it affects our lives and how we should think about it, how we should allow it to change us. This rupture between numbers and nerves makes it difficult for individuals, particularly when suffering from anxiety and cognitive impairment, to comprehend what the algorithms are saying. It also threatens to make results of these algorithms vulnerable to misrepresentations, either accidentally created or purposely fabricated. Therefore, the presentation of this data, including its visualization, must be carefully and conscientiously designed and tested. Second, we must remember the problem of scale. Big data works on large data sets where a certain allowance is made for small errors and approximations. There are undoubtedly occasions, as Mayor Schoenberger and Coutier assert, when, quote, 2 + 2 = 3.9, and that's sufficient. But there are other occasions where 2 + 2 needs to equal 4.0 and nothing else will do. Dementia diagnosis is fuzzy enough as it is. We can't expect families to show much empathy for the overall accuracy of the big picture when the small picture is hanging in the balance. Furthermore, big data, like so many other things in life, works on principles of randomness. As Ian Hacking showed us many years ago, massive data collection moves us away from deistic determination into the realm of randomness and probability. A realm which, with its statistical qualities of likelihood, probability, and central tendency, has a beauty, significance, and power all its own. When perceived at the macro level, randomness can look impressive, as we see in this representation by artist Chris Jordan. But individuals confronting dementia, like those confronting other terminal diagnoses or other unexpected disasters, are experiencing randomness at a more intimate proximity. And at close quarters, randomness can look as unsightly as the plastic bottles that make up the lovely surface of this picture. When you're watching a loved one's independence and cognition dwindle into helplessness, while your neighbor celebrates her 90th birthday by running a marathon, it's not easy to derive consolation from that grand sweeping probability distribution. Big data, as used in the two studies I've mentioned, shows a real potential for improving diagnosis and treatment of dementia in its early stages. And they do so in large part by carefully defining the limits of their scope and avoiding the rhetoric of alchemy that pervades much of the popular literature on predictive analytics. However, the widespread adoption of such methods would raise important questions, and those questions must be answered. We cannot afford to treat these machine learning algorithms like closed boxes. At the risk of looking like fools, we all have to open the boxes and get at least some understanding of how these systems work. And finally, we must never forget that global patterns of the human community inscribe themselves sometimes brutally on the most intimate aspects of individual lives. Whatever improvements these tools bring about, we must communicate what we know to patients and their families with honesty, tact, and compassion. Thank you.
So we can start with some questions here, and then Matt, you can pick some online.
Thanks, Grant. Really precise and developed. I love the presentation. I really like your questions. And when you talked about the social construction of dementia in the end, I started thinking about the relationship between the doctors, physicians, and the machinery, the AI. And forgive me, I came in slightly late, so if you spoke to this, forgive me. But I'm just wondering what your thoughts are. Speak a bit more on that. I'm immediately thinking about how doctors are humans and they vary so much. And obviously their knowledge of what this kind of tech is going to vary. And do you think, you don't have to speak about it necessarily in terms of ethics, but it's what's coming to mind for me when you start looking at the actual human component where the physician's concerned. Do you have any thoughts on that, like as a sort of concluding bullet point to add?
Yeah, I do. I think, again, I'm not a doctor, so I'm imagining here, but from what I have read and from what I've been picking up, there is a problem in the sense that I think it goes to the root of the idea that enhanced precision is not the same as enhanced certainty. In a case where you have a very vague and ill-defined condition that needs to be described, and you have an anxious patient who wants to know, okay, what am I dealing with here? Okay, I've got to make decisions. I've got to make some changes here. I need to know. If your conventional diagnostic procedures do not produce a precise result, the temptation is to automatically go to other tests, other procedures, other models, which profess to provide greater certainty. So this is where a lot of the interest in biomarkers comes in genetic testing. The idea that if you have, if you carry certain genes, you are more likely to get dementia than not. And the apparent precision of these tests, well, actually, the genuine precision test mostly, but the precision of this test is attractive to people who want clear answers. But very, very often, the result of these precise tests is another version of we don't know. And so I think from the doctor's point of view, the doctor's humanity comes, I think, in the instinctive tendency to respond to that pressure to continually test and lead the patient into more and more analyses, none of which at the moment are leading to any significant increase in certainty. It takes real power of personality, I think, to explain to somebody across your test. I know you're uncertain, and I know you've heard that magnetic resonance imaging has potential, or genetic testing has potential, but it is not likely to be useful in this case. That's hard to tell somebody. It's hard to appear that you are refraining from doing all that is humanly possible. And I think that's where a lot of the, in this case anyway, where a lot of the human responses of the doctors comes into play. It also comes into play, going away from the doctors for a minute. I think one of the things we really have to take into account is the fact that there are some people who are incredibly entitled in their lives and could go cruise through their lives with advanced dementia while nobody ever noticed. I mean, there's, I remember being at a reception for my uncle who was finance minister under Louis Saint-Laurent, and I mean, the man sat there with a never-emptying tumbler of scotch, saying, "How do you do? How do you do? How do you do? How do you do?" And everyone's running around saying, "Isn't he marvelous? Isn't he splendid?" The guy could have been half asleep and nobody would have noticed. Whereas his sister, who was living on a very small pension, we were worrying every day. How is she coping? How can she manage? We're seeing signs of confusion. Is this, is this something? there are a lot of people who can do their lives very nicely in advanced states of well, I wouldn't say advanced states, but certainly in the mild to moderate states of dementia without anybody noticing. And there are other people where it's absolutely clear. And I think this needs to be factored into our understanding of diagnosis of dementia, is that it's going to appear differently in different social settings. And I'm not sure that the algorithms are capable of handling that.
It's just quick, and I love your last point about, what people can be entitled. And one of the examples of that would be politicians in office who start to lose their faculties. And Ronald Reagan was the famous case. And if you want a more current one that's kind of ongoing now, look at Patrick Leahy, the senior member of the U.S. Senate from Vermont. And yeah, he's been, well, nobody talks about it. I just see it. And so but that would be just an example to kind of make the point about how people around someone respond according to not just that person, but to the larger system. Yeah. That's
On the flip side of that is the people who raise the alarm bell of dementia when they want to attack a candidate.
Yeah.
And I mean, how many accusations of dementia has Joe Biden been?
right. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, just a couple of no questions actually, maybe comments. You were saying that it's not the analytics to replace the doctors. Again, that's not what analytics is all about. Analytics is supposed to provide insight to help the professional. I think that's the key thing. And the other thing is, actually, Dementia is here, is the postdoc who's Peter or no, work permit is delayed. Actually, she's going to work on big data, how it's being used in education. And the study is more about comparison between Canada and South Africa. And we're hoping that as she gets along, she will get to make presentation at the program back for people to know more about it. Then the other thing is, yes, Grant doesn't know about statistics, doesn't know about computer and all these things. So we're going to help you. And what I know we're going to help you. So the course that I'm going to teach next, maybe in the summer next year, is application of data, data science, information profession. So again, it will be maybe not too technical, but I think we talk about some of those techniques, the predictive analytics you're talking about, the logistic regressions and things like that. So at least now we present our students, the graduate students, well, I think some of the simple techniques that they can apply. From there, they can take it up and learn more about the esoteric one.
Yeah, I want to go back to your first point, because I think this is the question of does machine learning, is machine learning meant to replace personal judgment? There are times when it is presented as doing just that. You have that. There are many cases where particularly in areas of human resources and such things, where it is deliberate. It is deliberately pointed out. Your human judgment is subject to heuristics that can lead you into prejudice, and that machine learning can provide an assessment that is free of those, and thereby you should substitute your gut feel that says that Alex would be better for a job and give the job to Karen, because it takes away from that embedded unconscious sexism, which leads me to assume that Alex as a man would be better at the job than Karen would. So I think I think it is very, very important to keep that distinction in mind, that data science, as originally envisioned, is not meant to substitute for human judgment, but it is often presented as something which will, okay, we don't have to worry anymore, and certainly we don't have to justify ourselves anymore because look, here's the results of the score. You clearly are not suitable for this job, and I don't have to think any further. And that's never been, as far as I know, what data science was about. But that's how it is being presented, and we need to resist that.
I just don't want to keep on going in that direction. There is a whole lot of development in recently with large language models and algorithms that can create art on demand with prompts and it creates images. And these are generally considered to be creative works, things that were computer scientists expected to take a very, very long time to be automated. And now you can create award-winning art with a button. And it seems to me like the creative end of human endeavors being automated this soon leads me to believe that there's going to be people who look at those efforts and say, well, what do we need artists for? You can just automate it. And the creative endeavors don't seem to be hugely distinct from the sorts of skilled creative insight that doctors and diagnosticians make use of, in at least in the space of things that we assume are difficult to automate. So it seems probable to me that there's going to be a strong push, especially because budgets are what they are. Reduce the labor costs by introducing those, that would be valuable. So I see that as plausible. So my question to you is, what do you talk about all the algorithms that exist now, but what algorithms do you see coming down the pipe as the ones that we need to deal with? What do you see as a plausible future? And more importantly, what do you see as a desirable future?
The desirable future, are you thinking in terms of dementia diagnosis?
In particular, yes.
Yeah, in
But
particular.
more generally.
I actually, to be honest, I think the studies that I selected are pretty good indications of how I would like to see big data working. I would like to see big data working in the sense that it enhances our access to data that tends to get lost. I mean, we accumulate all of this stuff. We accumulate all of these records, and it doesn't take long for them to get too big for any conventional analysis. And I think to be able to get access to our data history, if you will, the fact that all of these decisions that were made at these memory clinics between 2005 and 2017 are no longer just simply sitting there and rusting, but they're actually being used to fabricate ideas of how we can do things better. That is all to the good. I think the real distinction between a future I'd like to see and a future I would not like to see is an age-old distinction between people who are fond of working and people who are fond of not working. I think anything that stimulates creative and imaginative and rigorous thought on something is good. When it becomes a substitute for that kind of rigorous thought and becomes something that enables us to be lazy, particularly that whole thing of I don't have to think about this anymore because the machine takes care of it. I mean, yes, we all live in that state. We always have lived in that state. I mean, I still have no clear understanding of how the zipper on my fly works. I've just trusted it to work for 63 years, and it hasn't let me down since. But we all rest on technology we don't completely understand. But I think we have to resist that impulse to allow automation to prevent us from thinking and prevent us from asking questions. And I think as a discipline, particularly a multidisciplinary discipline like LIS, and forgive me if I'm pontificating here, but I think we have to lose our shyness about conceding the limits of our knowledge. And we need to combine with the people who do have the knowledge. I think we become so, we're so shy about admitting I don't understand this, or I'm only just getting the hang of this. But the fact is, in most multidisciplinary settings, most of us feel that way about at least one aspect of the project, and I think that's very important. Lisa, you had a question.
Dr. Grant, thank you. I'm so happy to hear you talk about this work. I mean, there's so many dimensions of the project, and I'm always grateful for the opportunity to express my attention. At some point, it would be good to be in conversation with you about the always contentious category of social construction. I don't think there's anything not socially constructive about logistic regression, which doesn't us precisely. That would be a solution overall. But I wanted to, in the sort of ethical oscillation between people and numbers, and what is humanistic and what is productive, I wanted to ask about what can be humanistic about probability, and in the context of, as opposed to the specificity of a given diagnosis versus the broad predictives of whole populations or illnesses. And I was trying to think of an example of when probability, even when it's not in your favor, would be comforting to try and shift the presumptive distinction between people and numbers. And the best example I can think of is the difference between saying why me when you receive a diagnosis and why not. Like, I think there's something quite comforting about it. Why not? Like, why would I use the diagnosis that captures X proportion of the population? And whenever I've heard people, that seems to be appeal to probability. It's quite humanistic, as opposed to productive. And it's not that you did something wrong. It's not that you did encourage. It's not that your family manifests these kind of hereditary abnormalities. It's not that you didn't take the news. It's that it happens. And like continuing with the fact that it's happening, I would like to see that there are more opportunities to recognize that and feel.
Okay, here comes the Star Trek quote. One of my favorite lines in Next Generation. It is possible to make no mistakes and still lose. That is not a malfunction, that is life. There is something, I think, where the comfort level comes in is that point where the person stops obsessively revisiting the past to figure out what on earth I did wrong. One of the things I looked at a while ago was blog entries by people with dementia, and I was using Faraday's relational matrix, which is a pretty obscure LIS paradigm. I was using that to compare the way in which concepts were combined in professional information sheets on Alzheimer's and the blog entries by the people who actually had Alzheimer's. What I found was that the concepts of dementia and causation were very, very prominent with the medical community, and almost non-existent with people with dementia. They focused on if they looked at the past, they looked at it in a spirit of organizing their understanding of their lives, presumably to bolster up their own memory, and also a surprising number of and a large number of intransitive references. I ran, I walked, I slept, I thought, I prayed. I think probability is actually close to spirituality in the sense that it concedes the presence of something beyond our immediate control that has a factor on our lives, which alleviates our sense of responsibility for having complete certainty over everything that happens. And I think that, so if I were following up the notion of positive concepts of probability, I think that's where I'm. Nothing on Zoom. Yeah.
So I'm fortunate enough to be working with the work, so there's definitely some parallels here, particularly in predictive nature of, the algorithm potential for big data. And I guess, but coming back to sort of how professionals, how doctors, how the healthcare folks who are utilizing the tool might respond to it, having in a previous life been a palliative social worker for many years. I think if it was available to me, I might feel simultaneous like relief and resentment at it, like relief in the sense of like the weight of making that decision impacts having what being the diagnostic criteria is based on instinct and information and gathering and communication and relational processes, all of those things. And it would take a really experienced, confident, almost arrogant practitioner to say, speaking for social, I don't know what doctors, but as a social worker, to say like, the computer is wrong. I know what's happening here. And I think Virginia Eubanks found something similar in her in automating inequality with child welfare social workers who, in using the predictive algorithm to predict child abuse, they the presence of that wasn't seen as a member of the team that was making those decisions, but was seen as and I'm not sure how, with all our sort of cultural and social narratives around the sort of omniscience of technology, I'm not sure we're at a place where we can. So that's not really a question, more general ramblings, but
I think one area that might be helpful in helping us through that is looking at the history of the experience of general practitioners in explaining screening tests. I think that's an area where the statistics involved in predicting the predictive value of a screening test is far more complicated than it looks on the surface. The idea that if you take a maternal serum screening test and you get a particular figure that, it looks, for all the world like, you're on a collision course and, it's all but certain that something dreadful is going to happen. And it is only by laborious, patient, and often repeated explanation of the statistical principles behind it that the GP is able to explain to that pregnant woman. Okay, that does not mean what it looks like. Doctors and healthcare workers do have long experience, long before big data, in explaining to frightened, vulnerable people some very, very complex issues of probability. And I suspect that there are, buried in the literature there, and again, this is something where my expertise doesn't come in, buried in the literature, there are really useful insights on how to present this information in a way that keeps it in its proper balance and doesn't create what you're describing as that knee-jerk trust in the automated algorithm, which which has a tendency to overwhelm us when we are, when we're in that situation. Because it's all of that cultural conditioning that says that the computer doesn't make mistakes, and I'm a human being and I do. And so so my instinct is, let's go back to what's been done before and figure out what worked before and see if there's any way that could be adapted to what you're describing.
It's 1 o'clock right now. And I just want to ask you to join me in thanking Grant for a very fascinating talk today.
Thank you for coming. It's lovely to see you.
Just after this.
Yes, exactly.
Thanks, Grant. That was really. Yeah, I'm gonna order or chat. A couple questions.